Now, one of the ways in which this principle of incommensurability, this principle that we could call the don't sell your grandmother principle, one of the ways that it works itself out in Derrida's thought is in terms of this very famous phrase of his, every other is wholly other. It's a little bit like there's nothing outside the text of ethics. It's the key phrase for understanding Derrida's position on ethics, or at least one of them. In French, it's a little bit more aesthetic than in English. Tout autre et tout autre, a lovely symmetrical phrase. What it means is that every other, tout autre, is wholly other, completely other. Or sometimes it's translated every other one is every bit other. Now, all that this is saying is that everything is unique. Everything is like your grandmother. You wouldn't exchange it for anything else because it's the uniqueness of the thing that would be lost. You can't just substitute one person for another without an irrevocable loss. And really, you can't just substitute one object for another without an irrevocable loss either. There's no common measure that can be used to completely do justice to any two objects because they're unique. Now, Derrida talks about this in relation to Genesis, and particular to the treatment of Genesis by the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. And in Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard talks about Genesis 22, where Abraham goes up Mount Moriah to sacrifice his son Isaac, and then is stopped from doing so at the last minute. Derrida sets up, following Kierkegaard, an opposition here. And it's an opposition between traditional morality, what common sense would tell you to do, and an absolute and immediate, singular and unique call of God, telling Abraham to sacrifice his son. And Kierkegaard and Derrida after him reason in the following way. They say, if Abraham had followed convention, he would not have been prepared to sacrifice his son. He would have had to disobey the absolute injunction of God. But he obeys the absolute injunction, the direct voice of God, and therefore has to go beyond all conventional morality, everything that his common sense tells him, and everything, supposedly, that the ethics of the time would have told him as well. In order to do justice to this singular call, he's got to put aside all the universal measures of morality. Derrida then says, when Abraham accepts his responsibility by heading off towards the absolute request of the other beyond knowledge, his action highlights, quote, the paradoxical condition of every decision. It cannot be deduced from a form of knowledge of which it would simply be the effect, conclusion, or explicitation. In other words, what Abraham has to do there, ignoring all the usual conventions and just obeying this singular absolute voice, that has to happen in every decision. Now, think of it in the example of a decision in a court of law. Is this person guilty of murder or not? I'm trying to put the singular individual case into a general universal rule. And it never fits perfectly. There's always some aspects of this case that weren't exactly what was envisaged by the general rule. Perhaps some mitigating circumstances, perhaps some context that I haven't yet taken into account. And in that sense, this sort of decision is like the Abraham decision. I have to put aside universality and convention to a certain extent in order to do justice to the uniqueness that's before me. Now, Derrida also says what can be said about Abraham's relation to God can be said about my relation without relation to every other as wholly other, tout autre comme tout autre. In particular, my relation to my neighbour or my loved ones, who are as inaccessible to me, secret and transcendent as Yahweh. So every other person is just as other to me, just as different, just as unable to be understood by my existing categories as God is. And therefore, when I engage with people, I can't simply assume to know what they mean, or simply assume that they will think exactly like I do. I have to always, if I want to do justice to them as unique singular beings, bracket my assumptions and listen to them in a way that doesn't try and force them into a pattern that I have pre-prepared for them. So then, what we've got in the Kierkegaard story, as Derrida retells it, is a traditional moral code on one side, you don't sacrifice your children, versus an immediate injunction from the other, the absolute other, God, on the other side. And you can't obey both of those at once. Now, that is a fundamental structure of Derrida's ethics. Hold on to this structure, traditional moral code versus immediate injunction to do justice to the uniqueness of the individual, and you're a long way to getting your head around the way that Derrida thinks about ethics.